Hi, everyone. I'm Tony Bernardo, Dean of UCLA Anderson, and I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion, The Global Supply Chain Disruption Explained. I'm happy everyone could join us for this important and timely conversation. We're lucky to have three of our own UCLA Anderson experts here for this discussion, and I'll introduce them briefly in just a moment. Disruptions to the global supply chain are pretty much on everyone's mind these days, and for good reason. Whether you're launching into some holiday toy shopping for your kids, thinking about buying a new car or a dining room table, trying to get a household appliance repaired, or like me, if you're just waiting for your new set of golf clubs, you're probably feeling the effects of supply chain disruptions. In recent weeks, an unprecedented number of container ships have been idling off the ports of LA and Long Beach, contributing to high levels of air pollution for nearby communities and forcing delays that have drawn action from the White House. But despite all this, and the fact that you can hardly look at a news site or engage in a conversation without hearing something about the issue, many of us don't really know much about it or what the factors are that have gotten us to this point. Fortunately, we have a number of experts here who can help, and my hope is that at the end of this hour, we'll all know a lot more. I'm joined today by three UCLA Anderson experts who can help us understand the issue of supply chain, what it is, how it affects the economy, and what short and longer term issues might be. To allow as much time as possible for our conversation, I'll just introduce them very briefly. Leila Bengali is an economist with the UCLA Anderson Forecast, and along with Anderson Forecast Director Jerry Nicholsberg, she is responsible for researching and writing the California Forecast. Felipe Caro is a professor of decisions, operations, and technology management, and he holds the Bing Class of '86 and Alice Liu Yang Endowed Term Chair in Management. Felipe is also faculty director of Anderson's Master of Science program in Business Analytics. And we're also joined by UCLA Distinguished Professor Christopher Tang. Chris is Anderson's Senior Associate Dean for Global Initiatives, faculty director of the Center for Global Management, and he holds the Edward W. Carter Chair in Business Administration. I know many of you have submitted several questions already, which will guide our discussion. And we may get to some of the other ones at the end of our time. But if you have other questions, please submit them via the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get to them as many as we can before the end of the hour. But why don't we get started? So first, I know in the last few weeks, as we said, we're all hearing and we're all using the term supply chain. I think it's important that we define it. What is a supply chain? Why is it important? And why do we study them? So Chris, perhaps you could get us started.
Well, thank you, Tony. It's a really honor to be here today with joining you and also two distinguished experts. Before I start, I want to wish everyone had a good Thanksgiving, and then you got the turkey that you wanted last week, and hoping that your family can get the toys that you want for the holiday season. Now, let me just say a few words about supply chain. When supply is plentiful, supply chains are invisible to you, even though it is omnipresent. Everything you use, everything you touch, everything you eat, everything you drink, everything you see, everything you listen, everything involves supply chain operations. I can guarantee you that. Now, so it is invisible to you because we have all taken for granted. But when the supply shortages occur, then supply chain issues become much more visible. So let me use a metaphor. In the morning, when you flip on the light switch on, you expect the light to come on all the time. What if it doesn't come on? Oh, then it's about, it is your fuse was broken? Was it because your transformer outside your house was have problem? Or the substation or the transmission lines was during the storm was really disrupted, or the power plant, or in China it would be the coal. They did not get enough coal. So therefore, there's no electricity. Now, when that happens, then you panic. So supply chain is essentially a network. It started from the raw material suppliers, such as your turkey farmer, to the semi-finished supplier, could be the slaughterhouse. Then to the manufacturer, that would be your meat packer, such as Hormel or Tyson, right, that you know of. And then to the distribution center, to the warehouse, to the retailers, to the supermarkets, and then to you. So we have taken it for granted until one day, things did not happen. Until one day when you clicked on your mask and the mask did not show up. Then you panicked last year, right? So that's why we are really facing a very unprecedented situation that everyone is looking at these issues. I'm going to stop here.
Thanks, Chris. So as we all know, and I discussed earlier, we have supply chain disruptions. As you mentioned, when the light doesn't come on, we panic. Felipe, can you tell us what have been the causes of these current supply chain disruptions? Why are we facing the problems that we are today?
Well, thanks, Tony. And again, I'm going to thank everyone for putting this panel together. I guess the answer to that question, everyone has heard it. It's this perfect storm, and the perfect storm in this case affects not only the supply side, but also the demand side. So as Chris mentioned, the supply chain is this network, but it's driven by demand. So everything is in response to demand. And here what we've seen is shocks on both ends, on the demand side and on the supply side. Let me start with the demand side. I think that's maybe something that many of you can relate to. So first of all, because of the lockdowns, for instance, people couldn't go to the movies, couldn't go to restaurants. So all that disposable income that people had for, entertainment, let's say, started to accumulate. And people were in their homes and, they started to spend more time in their homes and they wanted more goods. So we started to see a shift from services to goods. And many of them are imported goods that either are made abroad or that most of their raw materials are required from, other countries. So that shift already started to create a shock of demand for goods. And among the goods, there was also some, shifting happening. If you remember, like at the beginning of the pandemic, what happened with toilet paper, there was a lot of panic there. And maybe later we can talk a little bit about that. But also there was a shift in the mix. Like all the industrial grade toilet paper was no longer demanded because, offices were shut down, restaurants were shut down, and we all wanted to buy toilet paper for homes. So that this shift in the mix also added to the demand shock. And later on in the pandemic, you start to see also it's additional stimulus. So people had even more income to buy stuff. So that's on the demand side. Now on the supply side, there's so many things, and probably I'm going to miss a few. But let me mention a couple, and the rest will come out, as we continue with the discussion. First on the lockdowns also affected people that work at factories. So there was demand for these goods, but the people who make these goods couldn't go to work because there were lockdowns. On top of that, you start to see other restrictions, like for instance, you've heard in China, there's been restrictions in terms of power generation that of course affects all the factories. Add to that labor shortage that's happening everywhere. Here in the US, finding truck drivers, all those things have been adding to the supply side problem. And then comes the imbalance in the shipping. That is, everything that you've heard about, the containers being in the wrong places, the ships returning empty without the empty containers, so they don't have containers available in the port of origin. All that started to create additional bottlenecks, which we didn't see before because everything was running so smoothly. And finally, I would add, there's another layer of complexity because of just what's going on with climate change, which is making, unpredictable weather. Even that is making things harder. So I'll stop there, but I'm sure I missed a few that will come up later.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. And let me sort of pivot to something, because you raised an issue that I think is on a lot of people's minds. Obviously, these supply chain disruptions have resulted in inflation, in significant inflation, particularly for certain types of products, used cars and new cars. New cars, for example, because There's a semiconductor shortage, and as a consequence of reduction in supply of new cars, that resulted in high prices of those selling much above MSRP, and then that goes to the new used cars which are substitutes. So we've seen inflation. Some of the things you mentioned, though, Felipe, you mentioned were kind of COVID related, which suggests maybe this inflation is short run oriented. But some of the things you mentioned suggest that some of these problems are long run oriented. So Leila, if you could help us understand, because I know a lot of people are very concerned about inflation in one way or another. With 6% inflation in the last 12 months, that's outstripped many wage gains that people have had. It's made it very difficult for some people to maintain the quality of life that they're used to. Many people are concerned about what this means for their investment strategy. Can you help us understand how these supply chain disruptions have affected inflation, and to what extent those disruptions are short-term versus long-term?
Sure. Well, first, I want to follow the lead of my fellow panelists, and thank you, Tony, for inviting me to be on this panel, and thank my fellow panelists. It's a great honor to be talking to you all today. So I think first what I want to do is set the stage. So I'm an economist with the forecast, and I'll be sharing some insights from the forecast and giving you the forecast perspective in general. I'm not going to try to speak for my colleagues, but I'm drawing on all of our expertise here. So you get a bigger bang for your buck in terms of where all of the insights are coming from. And I think what will be helpful first is to make sure everyone's on the same page about what inflation means. So inflation is the rate of change of overall price levels. So when you hear in the news or you hear people say inflation is increasing or inflation is higher now than it was before the pandemic, that means the rate at which prices are rising has gone up, not just that prices have gone up. So then we need to think about how are supply chain disruptions affecting the rate at which prices are going up. And this goes back to the economic principles of supply and demand. When supply goes down and demand goes up, prices will tend to rise. And if this happens all at the same time for a lot of different markets across the US and across the world, that's going to mean that overall prices are going to go up. So a lot of the supply chain disruptions we're talking about are about supply being delayed or supply not being there at the same time that demand has gone up, or that demand has rebounded more quickly than suppliers expected or anticipated. So to give one concrete example, energy prices, oil prices have all gone up recently. Inflation for those categories is quite high, higher than it has been in the past. And energy and oil, those are all key inputs to production. And thinking about the supply chain is one way to help explain why the prices in these categories have gone up and why prices overall have gone up. So if we think back to March 2020, sort of mid to early 2020, demand for energy really collapsed. So that brought prices down. So output went down, not because necessarily of a lack of workers, but because for example, for a lot of US oil producers with the low prices, it didn't make sense to produce. The prices were too low to justify production. So now drawing on some insights from my colleagues, a number of oil producing areas in the US use rigs that have relatively short lives, and you have to keep investing in that capital in those machines. Companies stopped investing in those new machines because they weren't sure when demand was going to pick back up. And what we're facing now is a situation where demand picked up faster than those companies anticipated, and that's led to shortage of supply. The amount of oil that the US is producing is much lower than it was before the pandemic, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing high energy prices, high oil prices, and that's a key input to production. Therefore, that's going to tend to push up prices for other products as well. So thinking about the future, essentially until supply chain disruptions ease, while we're facing a situation where there are these disruptions, we'll likely see upward pressure on prices. Maybe another way to put it is that unless supply chain issues get worse, we at the forecast expect price pressure to start to ease, looking at a downward trend, not an immediate sharp drop in price levels or the rate of inflation, or I should say, and the rate of inflation. We still expect inflation to stay above the Fed's target in the near term. So it's a matter of, is something going to happen to make supply chain issues worse? What could possibly happen? So this is a little bit of speculation here, but if countries that have more stringent or more zero tolerance policies towards outbreaks, if those countries shut down their ports or their factories, that could exacerbate or sort of make worse supply chain issues, which could put upward pressure on prices.
Great. Thanks. And just to follow up, as you go through the forecast, how are you seeing this affect the outlook for California? I mean, you mentioned some of the impacts throughout the supply chain and oil and so on. How does the forecast account for those sort of effects throughout the California economy, and how does that affect your outlook?
So I think looking at and thinking about the labor market here is going to be important. So supply chain disruptions have implications for labor supply and demand. If we're thinking about California kind of across the board, some of the other panelists mentioned there's a very high demand for labor right now. So the idea of labor shortages, not so much supply. This is particularly the case, what we're seeing in logistics industry. So think about transportation, trucking, that kind of industry, manufacturing and retail. So for California in particular, we have and we continue to forecast stronger job growth and job recovery in those logistics sectors, also tech to some degree, because of the high demand for labor in those sectors. Eventually, we're expecting supply to rise to meet this demand. And then thinking a little bit more broadly, and again, going back to economics, we're seeing a high demand for labor. And that's going to tend to put upward pressure on wages. There's kind of no shortage of stories in the news about companies offering higher wages or benefits to try to entice people to take those jobs. So that will tend to put upward pressure on wages in those sectors and potentially in other related sectors. If I know that my skills are well suited to working in logistics and working in construction, if I know that I can get a very high wage in logistics, that raises my reservation wage to take a job in construction. So those are some of the ways that supply chains in particular can have implications for the larger economy and sort of which sectors we think in California, for example, will lead the recovery.
Okay, great, thanks. And some of the things that have caused us to be where we are related to COVID. Some of them are less so and not so much related to them. For example, the semiconductor shortage is partly related to it, but not fully related to it. And Chris, I was wondering, you study a lot about resilient supply chains. And this is an example where, for whatever reason, auto companies, other firms that rely heavily on semiconductors, for example, have really seen a large reduction in their business. How do you see companies reacting to this and perhaps changing the nature of their supply chain so that they are more resilient to the kinds of shocks we've observed? Not necessarily COVID, but other shocks, some which might be climate related and so on.
Thank you. Well, I should let you know that I used to work in the factories. I was working at IBM factories and then all gone along the Hudson River. And then I was working at HP factories in California, also all gone, right? So over the last 30 years, I think the United States has hollowed out the manufacturing sectors. But then the underlying premises is there is a free market. There's an invisible hand. That's what Adam Smith said. It's a free market. Everything will work out. But it did not work out. Because when you have the COVID pandemic and also political pressure. So as a result, we've seen this kind of supply chain disasters. Now, the president, Biden, throughout the history, no US president has even paid so much attention to supply chain. So he has really chartered a review of the supply chain in February. So I had the honor to comment on the plan. And then he appointed John Bukhari to manage the ports, and now Pete Buttigieg in terms of supply chain movement. And also, even last 2 weeks ago, United States, the White House is introducing a supply chain dashboard to monitor the containers to the from the ship to the terminal all the way to the supermarket, right? So they have never realized it. So in that case, it shows how important it is because it affects the economic recovery of the United States. Point number one. Point number two is that this is really the perfect storm, as Felipe pointed out. Last week, 342 out of 500 Singapore company, 342 out of 500, 71%. They cited supply chain affected the earning in the third quarter. It shows how important it is. Now, the public, the private company, and also the government, they realize it is a wake-up call. We need to do something about it. So there are short-term solutions and long-term solutions. So for the long term, Biden has a Build Back Better program, and yet they don't really have a clear plan established yet. So they focus on four major sectors: critical minerals, semiconductors, high-capacity batteries, and also pharmaceutical products, right? So he only picked four areas. But how about the other areas? That is unclear. But at least there is a plan. On top of that, there's $1.2 trillion of an infrastructure bill. So that could help in terms of improving the infrastructure. Now, coming back to your early question to Leila, in terms of affecting California, I think right now there's a shortage of warehouse space. So in Los Angeles, the vacancy rate is only 1%. Nationwide, 3.6%. Right now, they're building commercial warehouses really tremendously. In the long run, there is a forecast from CBRE. They predict the e-commerce is going to continue to grow. Before e-commerce is captured around 15% of the market share. During COVID, it's 20%. They forecast in 10 years, it will be over 30%. So as a result, the retail space will become smaller, but the warehouse, especially for last mile warehouse, that to deliver your home within half an hour, because now they try to plan for that. So there would be a big boom of all this last mile warehouse so that you could have your Doritos at the middle of the night within half an hour, right? So I think that is the shift in terms of the e-commerce in the real estate. But in terms of the infrastructure to rebuild the Build Back Better for the manufacturing sectors, that will take decades.
And so I want to just follow up on this, and maybe Felipe or Chris, if you want to, companies over the last many decades have been offshoring a lot of activities. Is there going to be a sort of an onshoring? Do you think companies are going to rethink that strategy in the context? It's not just the COVID risks, but as Felipe mentioned, climate-related risks. Might we see a reversal of those decisions that we've seen over the last few decades? Either one, whomever wants to take that.
I can start, and Chris can follow, because it's funny that you asked this, because Chris and I, we wrote a blog about this probably 6 years ago. That was exactly that question about reshoring and whether it was really going to happen. And even though it was 6 years ago, I think some of what we wrote then is still accurate. To some extent, there will be a little bit. I mean, I think for some companies, it makes sense to have, manufacturing closer, especially some of it at least, because, engineering needs to be close to like the design people, close to where things are manufactured. At this point, it really matters that you have that close connection. But what we predicted back then, and I think has happened, is more than reshoring, you would see nearshoring. So companies bringing things maybe to Mexico, and only to some extent. It's not that they will completely pull out of Asia. And why wouldn't you pull out of Asia? Because if you already have the factories there, there's growing demand in Asia itself. So there's going to be demand to satisfy there. So it doesn't really make sense to shut down the factories. It's more the decision of where you open new factories when you start thinking, oh, should I open my next factory in Asia again? Or should I consider Mexico, for instance? I don't know. Chris, you can add, I'm sure, more.
Well, thank you. Well, you already said it so well. Maybe I supplement a couple of points. Right now, a lot of companies, according to Deloitte, there's a survey, it's around 50% of the companies, they're thinking about reshoring or nearshoring, right? But I also wrote an article about this is not practical unless depending on what you're going to do. Now, if focusing on cost, they've done studies. As Leila pointed out, the labor wages is going to continue to grow, and we are just not cost competitive. So before we outsource, the original intent is cost arbitrage. That well, you produce a product at low price and then you sell at high price. That's how you make money, right? So if you reshore back to the United States, even North America, the cost advantage is not there. So my argument is that this is a moment in time we need to pivot into some innovative production processes. So let me give you a couple of examples. Purely on cost, we cannot compete. Forget about it. Last year, because of COVID, there was a shortage of masks. There are 29 companies in the US. They immediately switched to make masks. Until December, everything was going to the roof. After the easing of mask wearing, after China opened up, the demand dropped to zero. So then most of them will be bankrupt because they cannot compete with Asian manufacturers. But my argument is that if they pivot into doing something innovative products, for example, leveraging the 3D printing capability, during normal times, they can use 3D printing to print regular items, but they're flexible enough. They can pivot to print the face shield and other products in crisis. Now that may be more viable, that's one. Second, in terms of pharmaceutical manufacturing, there's a new technology. FDA is evaluating it. It's called continuous manufacturing. That means that you don't need to produce the active pharmaceutical ingredient from China. You can actually manufacture the drug from the end, beginning to the end, within the same facility. Now, this is a new technology because that would eliminate the potential of counterfeit drugs, right? So I think that US needs to invest in innovative products, innovative processes, such that to regain that kind of advantage in the long run.
Can I add one last thing? Because when I was hearing Chris talk, something else came to my mind. Chris pointed out something very important that, in terms of cost, it's very hard to justify it. And this idea about the technological innovations is fascinating. But I would like to add something else. Companies don't only compete in terms of cost; they also compete in terms of time. And reshoring or nearshoring definitely fits that purpose. That you can have response times, what we call lead time in supply chain jargon. And time is money. So if you can have that advantage also of being quick, because you have manufacturing closer, it can also pay off, even if your costs are, manufacturing costs are a little bit higher.
Well, Felipe also reminded one thing I want to add. It's about carbon footprint. If we will bring back some of the manufacturing near shore, it will reduce the carbon emissions because right now they're concerned about the ships, right? Now, let me give you one example. In Dubai has the biggest vertical farming industry in the world. They actually grow vegetables vertically within the warehouse. Using solar panel, they recycle the water. It's completely sustainable. Then within the city center, they actually grow vegetables. And then they actually, transportation is just within miles. So therefore, it will really sustainable and also reduce carbon emissions as well.
Yeah, so I want to elaborate on that because, this is one of the issues of having all these ships in the ports and many people are very concerned about the environmental effects associated with that. And a lot of times those effects fall disproportionately on lower income communities based on the nature of where these ports are located and so on. Chris, is there more you can elaborate on the point you just made about to what extent companies, perhaps in this environment where ESG and so on is being monitored so closely, are thinking about more broadly the supply chain as a substantial part of their carbon footprint and really rethinking how to develop those networks to mitigate climate impacts?
Well, the companies I've been talking to right now, they're dealing with a crisis, get the product in. So they don't have the luxury to think about the carbon footprint yet. Yep. So that's a longer term. But right now, I think that's, as Felipe pointed out, I do see there is a potential to rethink about the NAFTA Part 2, USMCA agreements. I think that this could be a very exciting potential. So I'm trying to do a panel sessions in March with some of the CEOs who actually manage the port in Mexico. Mm-hmm. The port is called Lázaro Cárdenas. It's in the Michoacán province. And then actually they can cut across to Veracruz. From Veracruz, they can actually go to Louisiana or Mobile. So in that case, that actually could create more jobs with the port in the south, which is also a good thing. So I think the question is that can three governments work together such that it creates a win-win-win situation? So I think that is a longer term, but I think that's why not leverage the USMCA agreements to create more value for the North America.
Thanks. Leila, one of the questions we got in advance really wanted to understand in a more sort of granular way where the effects on the California or maybe even the national economy are going to be most felt. Does the forecast or do you have insights into particular industries that are going to suffer most in this environment? And one industry I think about, because we've been thinking about importing goods from elsewhere, but we're a large exporter of agricultural products, for example, and these supply chain disruptions worldwide might be having a significant effect on on this industry, which is so important in California. Are there particular industries or regions that are going to most acutely be affected according to your forecasts?
Well, I would say some of the industries we talked about earlier, logistics, I guess there are, you can think of winners and losers, though maybe that's too harsh of a way to think about it. But there are certainly industries essentially where demand is higher or has rebounded faster than suppliers expected that are doing relatively well in the sense that their demand is back up. So things like truck drivers, ports, those sorts of industries. Are they having a difficult time finding labor? To some extent, yes. So that's going to constrain growth to some degree in those sectors. Let's see. So this is somewhat related to your question, but I was, I think, an interesting piece of information, again, insight from my colleagues at the forecast, thinking about California's position as having very large ports. And we've been hearing a lot about backlogs at the ports and some discussion about, are companies going to decide, importers, exporters going to decide not to use California ports because they're so backlogged and goods can't come in and out. So what sort of interesting piece of information is that some people were saying the construction and the widening of the Panama Canal, along with this, along with the delays in California, might encourage companies to use other ports in the U.S. So to go through the Panama Canal, and that could, if that happens, could potentially have negative effects for the California economy because the California ports are so large. It turns out that, because these projects take so long to build, the canal's now not wide enough for the newest and biggest container ships. So that's going to keep some of the port traffic in California. And also there's a freshwater lake that's part of the canal. And with the drought, the water levels are lower and it takes longer to navigate this part of the canal. So if we're thinking about costs and benefits that a company would evaluate choosing which port to use, those two factors, the canal not being wide enough for the largest ships that are being built now, and the longer navigation times. Felipe, I think, mentioned time as an important decision factor in a business's calculus. Those two things are going to keep, we believe, and sort of forecast going forward, keep activity at the California ports, which is helpful for the California economy.
Great.
Can I ask, add something? I'm not very good at forecasts, so I wouldn't adventure like an industry or a particular type of products that are going to be hit hardest. But in terms of size of companies, I think it's very clear up to now that smaller companies are definitely going to be hit harder, and bigger companies, including Amazon, even if they're not going to make a profit this season, they're gaining a lot of market share, and they're being very aggressive about it. Investing, if you look in the news, how much Amazon has been investing in fulfillment centers, in their own network of airplanes to bypass the ports. And that is something, of course, they can do because they have the size. Yeah. In fact, I already did some Christmas shopping, and I did a little bit on Amazon, and things really came very quickly, actually. So in terms of who's going to get hit the hardest, definitely the smaller ones. So that goes back a little bit maybe to what policymakers have to be thinking about.
That's a really interesting insight. I hadn't thought about that, but it makes a lot of sense. Before we get to some questions from the audience, I just want to wrap that. I mean, you've clearly all demonstrated just how essential the supply chain is to our sort of daily activities, our ability to enjoy the standard of living that we have, but also how critical it is to the economy. Can you perhaps, Felipe and Chris, tell us a little bit more about what Anderson does to teach our students about these issues, and perhaps how we will rethink best practices going forward based on the experience of the last 18 months or so?
Okay, thank you. I have to give a lot of credit here to Chris. We have an elective on global supply chain management that was started and developed by Chris. I've been teaching it lately, but based on this framework that Chris developed. And let me point out a few things that I think are relevant to this discussion, and then Chris can add a few more. So things that, like, from a business school and in particular in a global supply chain class that we teach, the idea, like we were discussing about nearshoring, like there's one concept about dual sourcing. Like all my students are immediately gonna hear this and say, oh yeah, Professor Caro always talking about that. Dual sourcing means not putting all your eggs in the same basket, and in particular taking advantage, just like you put together like a financial portfolio, and you play with return and risk, and creating a portfolio of suppliers, you can do the same. And to make it simple, you can play with cost and lead time. So it might make sense to have some suppliers in Asia that are cheaper but slower, and a couple of suppliers nearby that are more expensive but faster. There's many advantages of that in regular times, but on top of that, in the case of the disruption, it allows you to be better prepared to respond. So that's one of the concepts that we teach. Another thing that I think is going to happen after this crisis is, just like in the financial crisis that we had before, one thing that came out was this idea of doing stress tests, like that banks had to do stress tests and see, how far they can, how much they can resist if some of their, lenders, borrows go under. You can do the same with a supply chain. And there is a lot of research that has been going on doing the equivalent of a stress test to your supply chain. And it can allow you to anticipate where are the weak links. So a couple of concepts that are relevant there is one, for instance, is time to survive, which is like every node in your supply chain, you can estimate how long can it continue running if, how long can the rest of the supply chain continue running if that particular node goes down? And then you have time to recovery, which is, well, how long would it take you to bring that node back up? And those are concepts that we cover in our class and that our students as MBAs later in the workforce can use. But I'll leave it to Chris, who had a few more.
Well, I think that there are a couple of very exciting things that the business school can leverage on. The first one is on the platform models, information. Because right now the White House is trying to establish a dashboard to keep track of information. Now, but as it turns out, most companies, they do not have the visibility of the supply chain. Around 60% of the companies, this is based on McKinsey, they only know the tier one suppliers. Mm-hmm. Go further down upstream, they have no clue. So right now there is a big push in terms of the ESG rating. So I met with Morningstar last week. They try to figure out how to do the ESG rating based on the supply chain transparency. So that's where the IT can come into play, right? So I think at the Anderson School, we do have classes that they talk about in terms of information systems. And in addition, I think that the ESG is going to be so big because right now it's a $30 trillion in terms of self-managed fund. It's going to grow up to $52 trillion. So I think this is also related to supply chain issues in terms of social responsibility, environmental issues, and governance, not within your organization. It's a further upstream. Now, many countries is now putting pressure on companies to look at the entire supply chain. In Germany, the parliament just passed a law, the Supply Chain Act. So that means that in 2023, if you're a big company, they are responsible for any wrongdoing, not in their company. It's anyone along the supply chain, right? Then the question is, how do you comply with regulations and yet you can monitor within your organization, right? So therefore, supply chain transparency, visibility, and how do you do the monitoring? How do you leverage technology such as blockchain, such as online platforms? It will become crucial.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
Because I listened to Chris and there's so many things that come to my mind. There's another very important point that we like to teach in the supply chain class. And it's trying to find what we call win-win-win solutions, where the manufacturers win, the buyers win, and the consumers win. And it's possible. It's possible, but it requires innovation in terms of technology, but also in terms of contracts, in terms of business models. So that's another very important place where MBAs can bring in creativity and how to find these solutions that make the pie bigger. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, it's such an exciting area of work, and what's interesting is as Chris mentioned at the beginning, we take it all for granted until it doesn't work, and then all these incredible research topics and learnings emerge from it, and that's why it's so important for us as a management school to stay on top of these issues and bring the latest thinking to our students. And it's wonderful to hear that that's what's ongoing. Let me take a few questions from the audience, and whomever among you would like to answer, please go ahead. One question, I'll rephrase it a little bit. It may be hard because I know these are not easy to forecast, but this question came from Amit Agarwal. He asks whether this is, if we look at this over a 10-year horizon, is this just a one-time blip? And you mentioned some things that may be shorter term, some things that may be longer term. And will these things normalize over 10 years, over a longer period of time? Do you have a sense of how, how much, what's a reasonable horizon to have some of the shorter term things balance out and and whether there are longer term issues that may take longer to resolve. More succinctly, when am I going to get my golf clubs?
Well, let me take a first step. Well, I think that this is a crystal ball questions, is a $60 million questions, and no one knows. But I think what is the most important part is we need to put COVID under control. If we cannot put it under control, this will prolong for a long time. So if we can put it under control, if you look at the ships outside Los Angeles ports, right now they're 46 anchored, but then they park the remaining 50 miles in the Pacific Ocean. Now, each ship will take around a few days to unload. A lot of people, they don't know that. To unload a 20,000 containers, it takes a few days, right? So that's why you can do the math. You can really run out for a few months. But I think that if everything goes well, by the middle of next year, the ports will back to normal because we run out of things to buy, right? So I think that is a short term. Now, for the long term, something is going to stick because I think that during COVID, we learned the country is vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. So, for example, moving forward, if we try to improve the climate, to reduce carbon emissions, if we want to really build the electric vehicle industry, we need the batteries. But the bottleneck to the batteries is lithium. But we don't have enough lithium. But then if you mine the lithium in the United States, it would disrupt the environmental issues. So now some of the research laboratories like Oak Ridge, National Laboratories in Tennessee, they try to explore using a more commonly available minerals such that they can provide similar structure such that the EV batteries can continue to produce inside the United States. Because when there is a political disputes, the car only needs one missing component, the car is not going to run. So I think there's certain things, I think that the Biden administration is aware of that. So right now, that's why they focus on 4 areas. So certain things is going to happen.
I just wanted to, oh, sorry.
No, please, Felipe, go. Yep.
No, I was going to point out, like, a week ago or so, like if you looked at these, what they call the purchasing manager indices, which are like regular surveys that they make to companies, and they kind of indicate like the sentiment and where things are moving. They were moving up slowly, very slowly, but they were all pointing up, and in a way saying, okay, we're getting out of this. But then this new variant came in, and now everything is starting to look like, okay, we're going to be in this for a bit longer. So I totally agree with Chris's point that we have to learn how to manage the pandemic. That's going to solve the short-term issues. Okay, so when we don't get into this frenzy that there's a new variant, and we get back into lockdowns and all that stuff. So that's in the short term, and then in the long run, I think a lot will have to do with climate change, because that's probably one of the biggest threats to supply chains.
Yeah, I really would like for you to elaborate on that, because I'm, when I think about some of the issues that face California, for example, you think about access to water, really extreme weather and fire and so on. That has huge implications for agricultural products, the production of wine, grapes, and so on. Just as an example, and that would naturally suggest that downstream companies are thinking about this, and they may be reevaluating where it is that they want to import these products from. And can you sort of elaborate on issues around climate, water access, and so on, and how that might sort of over time change the locus of activity and how these supply chain networks are formed? Because clearly, we've been focused a lot in this discussion around COVID, but the climate issue is a long horizon issue. And many of the questions that we're getting and many of the concerns that people have is this something that's just going to go away in a few months? But are there another set of factors that may require a kind of a reconfiguration of how of these supply chain networks?
So I can start, and maybe Chris, you add the additional points as usual. So I think you're right, Tony. There's so many things that are gonna have to be, rethought in terms of the supply chain, and the first step is something that Chris mentioned. So many companies haven't even mapped their supply chains. So they only know who their first tier suppliers are. So the first step is to start mapping all these supply chains and see, okay, go a few tiers up and figure out that, okay, we have this little raw material that is produced in Africa that is prone to all these kind of weather issues that become more drastic under climate change. And then you can start doing these kind of stress tests that I mentioned, of saying, okay, what happened if this node went down, if this node went down, and start to rethink how you design the supply chain, and sometimes how you design the product. Using technology, maybe you're going to need less of some of these raw materials. So there's a lot that has to happen here. I don't know, Chris, if you want to add more.
Okay, well, I think that's in California, agriculture is very important to the California economy. Now, because of climate change, there are companies start considering a different approach. First, in terms of cows, the methane gas is among all the animals, they generate the highest methane gas. So now there is a change. Maybe we reduce the consumption of beef, and then maybe use growing the meat in the lab. So reducing the production of cows. So they'll try to pivot using new technology. Now, in terms of food in the ocean, so now because they discover the climate is going, the temperature is going to increase, there's one particular plant that we can eat, is very common in Asia, is seaweed. The seaweed, it turns out they grow very well in the warmer climates. Then the third one, fish may have problems, seafood, but then there are two other types of seafood that is, they thrive in warmer climates, which is octopus and squid. So if we as human, we're willing to adapt to the new economy, to the new environment. So I think this is something is on the horizon, because unless we can control the climate change, but that is a very difficult problem. But at the same time, I think that some companies, they start developing this kind of technology.
Yeah, and I mean, we could get on this discussion, but I mean, the implications of this are pretty profound. One of the questions we received from a student before this program began is how does this affect geopolitics, trade agreements we might want to get into because of how essential certain countries might be in terms of providing key inputs in the supply chain, and the implications are pretty profound. And I think we could probably go on and on just on topics like that. But I mean, it's really incredible to think how these recent events have really forced us to rethink many aspects of how our economy and polity works. We're getting close to the end here, and I think this is probably a good time to end our discussion. I personally found this really illuminating and fascinating, and I want to thank our great panelists. Leila, thank you so much. Felipe, Chris, this was really wonderful. It's a timely discussion. It's something a lot of people are talking about. And I'm sure many of you, like me, didn't fully understand the issues involved, but it's our role as an academic institution to provide learnings on critical topics in business and society. And I'm really thankful for our three panelists for illuminating all of us on this really important set of issues. So thank you again. Thank you all for participating. And, I hope to see you all soon again. We hope to provide this kind of content ongoing when important issues arise. And so we hope to see you again in this kind of forum in the future. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.